So welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Erica Ivins, and I coordinate the Institutional Grammar Research Initiative, also known as the IGRI. Our IGRI Research Seminar Series features scholars from around the world who leverage the institutional grammar in their research to examine the origins, structure, and implications of institutional design. This virtual series usually takes place in the first Tuesday of every month. And today we're very excited to introduce our guest speaker, Matt Grimley. Welcome, Matt, who will be presenting on his recent co-authored publication, Institutions in Time, Designing Feedback Pathways for Shared Infrastructure Transitions. So Matt is a researcher with the Center for Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy, along with the Electric Cooperative Innovation Center at the University of Minnesota. He helps grassroots organizations organize, explore, and implement new energy transition policies, programs, and projects. His research focuses on change over time, particularly in topics of polycentricity, social innovation, economic democracy, and processes and temporality. He holds a graduate degree from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities in science, technology, and environmental policy. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to you, Matt, if you want to start your presentation.
Cool. Thank you so much, Erica. Let me just share this. Okay. Did I make it work? Is it seen?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, cool. I feel seen. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to present a little bit about our paper that's coming up in the special issue of Policy Studies Journal about policy design. So just to center everyone, take a look at this very complicated drawing. This is the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory representation of the electricity industry in New York in particular. So it's very complicated, it's very complex, but if you kind of break it down, on one side, there's a lot of very large resources, nuclear power plants, big wind turbines, transmission lines. And then all that has to get down to our businesses, our homes, and all the customers who need electricity to kind of live their day-to-day lives. And on that demand side are things like software, data, ones and zeros, batteries at the home, electric vehicles. How do you balance all that? That's the challenge of the electric grid as we go into the future, transitioning from what was once just a big supply side model into this combination of demand and supply side all working together. And so our paper really focuses on that within the context of electric cooperatives. So I co-authored this with then students, Mayuk, Anna, Sarah, George, Marnie, and also Professor Gabe Chan over here at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. So yeah, that's what this presentation is going to be about today. It's about how these electric cooperatives navigate through the energy transition in real time. I'm going to talk a little bit about them, how they're doing in it, and their particular institutional structures. And I think on the theoretical side, what really motivated us was just how can these actors engaged in real time in the energy transition actually design their own transition? I think a lot of these people have day jobs where they're engaged in it, but like how do you set about and plan it for themselves too? And then I think overall our article tries to answer this question, how can policy process research and the co-ops incorporate different theories of change and not just thinking about this like evolutionary model, but maybe there are different paths and motors and adjustment mechanisms to change that we all can think about. So this research is couched within the Russian nesting doll of CSTEP, the Center for Science, Technology, Environmental Policy. That's our department over here at the University of Minnesota, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. We have our own Electric Cooperative Innovation Center where we focus on doing these partnership research projects with co-ops around the nation, but in particular here in Minnesota, where we've partnered with Great River Energy over the past 3 or 4 years on this project we've been calling Dairy, not like the ice cream and skim milk or whole milk kind, but Distributed Energy Resource Innovation Initiative, where we try to focus on having regular contact with the co-ops, partner meetings, and exchanging research and notes and trying to help out where we can in their energy transition with these new demand side assets that they're bringing onto the grid. So I'll talk here a little bit about just what exactly electric cooperatives are and where we're at in the energy transition, just to center all of us. So for electric cooperatives, like I said in the introduction, like many other investor-owned or government-owned utilities in the nation, they've based a lot of their historical practices on these big centralized energy resources. This one on the left is Great River Energy's Coal Creek Station. Like a lot of these other big centralized energy sources, they've faced increasing pressures over time and even now to retire or be sold off in one way or another. They were started in the 1960s and right now they're getting a little bit too old, too costly and sometimes, and so they have to face this new emerging energy market of distributed energy resources. And so, like I said in the beginning, there's all these other demand side assets now. Electric vehicles, rooftop solar, energy storage, controllable smart thermostats, all these little myriad things, thousands and thousands of them across the electric grid that utilities can control now to help offset some of their customers' usage. And so they might not have to build in another enormous power plant going ahead into the future. And this context is very interesting for electric cooperatives. So electric cooperatives, a little bit of background for those not in the privy about them. They were started in the 1930s in the United States as a New Deal era policy to electrify the countryside. This was after many years of trying to incentivize investor-owned utilities and figuring out that government-owned utilities could only go so far before reaching some constitutional issues. And so through a lot of loans and different grants and things like that, gradually these electric cooperatives grew all across the United States. They cover the majority of the landmass, but represent about 15% or so of electricity sales in the US, with investor-owned utilities taking up about 60%, and those government-owned utilities, whether they're federal or state or local, taking up another 15 or so percent. Electric cooperatives number about 900 today. There's these distribution level cooperatives, the poles and wires that go to your house. And those number about 800 cooperatives around the nation. And then co-ops have co-ops, as one person once told me. They're kind of like cats. They have kittens. They're related to all these other co-ops. And so these distribution cooperatives back in the mid-1900s made their own generation and transmission cooperatives. And so on the left there, you'll see a map of the Great River Energy, which is a generation and transmission cooperative in Minnesota, or a G&T. And there are 27, now 26, the map's a little bit old, member cooperatives. So these co-ops are really interesting in that traditionally the G&T handles everything on the supply side, the distribution cooperatives handle everything on the demand side. But that role has blended over the years, and it's also blended institutionally for them. Co-ops are also very interesting because they elect board members democratically on the distribution level boards. That's unlike any other utility in the US. Sometimes municipal utilities will elect like commissioners or something like that, or have council members oversee their electric utility, but they have a lot of other duties as well. These are the only like democratic electric utilities in the US. And so down at the lowest level, the member consumers are responsible for maintaining home business using electricity, using and installing these distributed energy resources, anything on that distribution side, like I said, storage, EVs, controllable water heaters, and they elect boards, members to go up and govern the distribution level, which are the distribution level co-ops, which are responsible for building and maintaining distribution lines, setting the retail rates, planning for and marketing DERs. And then they, in turn, from their boards, the distribution level boards, appoint a board to go to the generation and transmission board to have the shared level governance. And then they also have shared governance through the member managers on the distribution level. And then they also have all these different shared groups too, where they exchange information. So you can see there's working from top to bottom, grass tops to grassroots in the system. There's a lot of different ways and levers to make change in the system. And I think the trouble with that, with any polycentric system, is like, where do you start? And that's sort of what motivated our project, is asking the people very directly, like, where do you start with that? Focusing on Great River Energy, other than having sort of a convenience sample factor for us, being in our home state here and in Minnesota, also is predicated on GRE having a lot of DERs in the first place. They have a historical load management program. Load management is a term for these electric cooperatives controlling water heaters, irrigators, home generators, even now electric vehicles in consumers' homes, so they can avoid that peak demand in that little box there. So the less peak demand you avoid in the system, the more benefits you accrue to everybody. And so it's this really interesting way of providing collective benefits to member owners who increasingly don't know they're even part of a cooperative, but incentivizing them to contribute collectively to the system while doing all these other goals, like electric planning, contributing to like environmental or social goals and other goals of the system. So this is really interesting because we came into this project thinking about, okay, how do we just engage these electric cooperatives and get them to think outside the box, get them to lay out all their ideas? And we got to the point where like, well, how do we analyze this? And we actually it was a bit of like problem and solution. We came to the institutional grammar, which was like perfect for it. And, as you all know, this being IGRI, institutional grammar identifies how the institutions themselves are set up grammatically and identifies what sort of rules those different statements can belong to. And so we thought this would be really interesting, looking back at this old paper by Ostrom and Pizurto back in 2011. You can use it to analyze change over time, or like a pathway for change. These boundary rules, moving from nothing to something, position rules from nothing to something, and all these different types of rules. And you can analyze how they're changing and moving over time too. So to analyze that, I think that sets up like the what of how they're changing, maybe not the how. And so we looked at a recent paper from Elizabeth Baldwin and other authors, setting up this context, operations, outcomes, feedback framework, where it's basically a modified IAD, where the difference, though, is in the operational arrangements and how they're looking at those arrows, those feedback processes coming back into those different sorts of governance structures, governance processes, and context changes in the system, too. And so in the study, we really wanted to look at how those contextual feedbacks, focusing on attributes of the social technical challenge, attributes of the actors, the overarching institutions, the structural feedbacks on the governance structures, and the process feedbacks on how these people are working with each other, to understand how they're moving from those different rules and be able to say the how and the what of how they might proceed prospectively going forward into the future on their energy transition. And we tried to couch this a little bit in how we're thinking about theorizing change in polycentric systems. The paper from Baldwin et al. Did a great job of laying out a foundation for how you analyze long-term change in polycentric systems. And, frankly, I come from more of a background of transitions research, where we're looking at all these historical changes and how you set up all these like little niche technologies to emerge in these regimes and landscapes of change over time. But I think just working on the ground with these practitioners, you begin to realize there's so many different motors and ways of looking at change over time too. For instance, that paper from Ostrom and Pisurto said, evolutionary change. There's variation, there's selection, there's retention of these different ideas and attributes and changes over time that people can partake in. But I think in reality, there's a lot of different ways of having ontologies and epistemologies about change too. And this also motivates us in our work with these electric cooperatives, because if we can think about these changes in different ways, that allows us to think about, okay, how can we affect change in the system too? So we use this framework from Cloutier and Langley, looking at these linear, parallel, recursive, and conjunctive change theories. Linear meaning something is just kind of going forward, full blast, nothing's pulling it back. Parallel change theories, maybe there's like a branch, a pathway, a new pathway that goes at one point or another. There's sort of a conjunctive change, two things affecting each other as they're going along. And then there's also these recursive changes, so things going in cycles, motors associated with like punctuated equilibrium theory, for instance, where there's periods of stasis, kind of goes up into peak and goes back down into stasis. But you can also see that with evolutionary change. Something gets selected, there's variation, and retention, just keeps on going in these loops, or there's life cycle sorts of changes too. And then finally, there's these conjunctive changes too, where, all of us were living our lives in real time. Things are happening without us even noticing it. And the past and the present and the future become blurred. This is kind of getting a little philosophical, but how you study that sort of change is different. You can use motion pictures, narratives, metaphors, poetics, a lot of really interesting engaged research, where I think a lot of polycentric governance research in the past has focused on these other like evolutionary changes at times, or linear changes, just moving from point A to point B and seeing how X affects Y. And so part of the point of this paper too is just also to open up the space for that dialogue to happen and think about how we can affect change, or how these actors are affecting change in their system in a lot of different ways. So we focused in our methods on using this nominal group technique to help elicit institutions in use versus institutions in forms, which I think a lot of the polycentric governance literature focuses on. Institutions in use are those spoken, those implemented, or those kind of performed institutions, which can be different from how they appear on paper. The nominal group technique, we believe, is actually a pretty good way to elicit them. There's been a couple papers in the past 5-10 years that have worked from interviews to elicit and then code these institutions in use from practitioners. But we found this, the nominal group technique is actually a pretty good way of eliciting these different ideas from people. So the gist of it is, it's a multi-step process. It's like a focus group. Step one, you have a silent generation of ideas in response to facilitator prompts. Step two, after everyone's kind of done getting all their ideas out, you go around in a circle and you write down everybody's idea on the board. You don't stop till you're done. And once all the ideas are vanquished, you just go around for discussion, act if there's any redundancies, or if anybody wants any clarifications. And then at the end, you vote on the best ideas that could be implemented for, well, in our case, these electric cooperatives. This technique was actually created by Andrew Van de Ven, who was a professor here at the University of Minnesota, and a big-time process scholar who found himself in organizational studies, but probably could have found himself in the institutional setting just as well. Above him, the picture of him, are the questions that we asked of the electric cooperatives during our study. So one focused on the current time and what sort of demand side DERs do they think about and want to use the most. The long-term time, T plus N, and near-term time, T plus 1. And really just trying to encourage them to think, okay, what's going on right now? What's going on in the future? And what are those sort of baby steps or near-term things that you could do to get to that point? And then we have this big process of turning their original ideas into these institutional statements or theoretical constructs. And so to do that, you have to do a lot of this legwork throughout there too. And that involves, you have to re-listen to all the video and the audio, make sure that, in this case, our student researchers didn't leave anything out, or there wasn't like a side comment that somebody made that like helps clarify something in the process of it. Fixing the typos in them, turning the ideas into active statements where necessary, adding in an actor, a subject, or an object to them. Oftentimes we had to infer actions or actors just based on our years of experience with these electric cooperatives. And that we actually have some notes about that at the end of the presentation too, because that aided us a lot in this work. And then for this research, we coded all the ideas and statements according to the Institutional Grammar 1.0 methodology. More of the basic kind. And then we added additional sort of like I guess like a tertiary level of codes related to technology types, actor types, and also feedback pathways and adjustment mechanisms to relate back to the COOF and the IG itself too. So this is just an example. This is a little extract from a table in our paper. And you can see for question 1, looking at the near term, the initial idea was like, oh, well, we put information on the website about the Inflation Reduction Act. And so you can say, well, the distribution cooperative may provide information on the IRA to the member consumers or the member owners on the Inflation Reduction Act. And for question 3, same sort of gist. You can infer that the distribution cooperative will analyze cost recovery with distributed energy resources to ensure adequate cost recovery. So that's sort of the general process of turning these into institutional statements. And then from that, we derived inductively these adjustment mechanism codes here in the center. So often they had to do, for instance, with information and payoff, which were our 2 biggest rules that we ended up coding for in this study, ideas or adjustment mechanisms around education, around marketing, around research, payoff rules around rates, so like what electricity consumers see in terms of like what prices they're seeing and what incentives they have. An example idea for the payoff rule would be, rates to promote a better load factor. That would be obviously an adjustment mechanism of rates. So that would be how a rule is changing, and we would also code that deductively based on the feedback pathway definitions given in the Baldwin et al. Paper around structural change, process-oriented change, or context-oriented change. So there's a few different layers going on here, but I think the general gist of the idea and what we wanted to try to get at was that these adjustment mechanisms are causing these rule changes through accumulating in these different sort of feedback pathways over time. And so by analyzing the accumulation of these adjustment mechanisms, feedback pathways, and rules, those combinations, you can begin to see, okay, maybe this is like the sort of the direction and orientation and the how of how these electric cooperatives might engage in their own transition and design their own policies for moving forward into the future. So we ended up with working with about 18 of the 26 member utilities in GRE, not including the 2 practice utilities that we worked with students to do. They got 66 staff and board members to attend these nominal groups. Took about 9 months for everything, with 5 people doing it and analyzing and working on other projects in the meantime too. But in the end, that generated 578 different ideas and 307 voted on ideas. So like at the end of that nominal group, you could turn your votes in and say, These are the best ones. So we end up with a very wide array of ideas and voted on ideas throughout all of this. So these are the results. I'm copying a little bit from the paper. So forgive me if there's I'm brushing over anything, but I just wanted to give you kind of the high points of this so you could relate to what was going on and what we were seeing in this. This diagram has a few different things going on. One is just the difference in percentages between the voted on and counted ideas, which is the total ideas and then everything that was voted on beneath that. So you can see there's a slight difference, but kind of the same percentages going across those voted on and counted ideas across all the time frames of the questions: current time t, near term time t plus 1, and long term time t plus n. The second thing to look at this diagram with is the technological choices that these cooperatives are making with their distributed energy resources, how to move ahead with the small things in their energy transition. We had categories of general DERs where people are saying, well, we just want to get rates out to encourage all kinds, or we want to do education just to let the member owner themselves figure out what is best in the situation. Load management, that historic program that they engaged in, distributed generation like rooftop solar, electric vehicles, electrification where you just air source heat pumps or electrifying heat. That is other category of grid infrastructure, which may include things to facilitate all these different categories. Along with energy efficiency, think about insulation in your home, energy storage, and then this other category for like little special things like small modular nuclear in some cases. The big thing that jumps out here is just the big difference in the near term time t plus 1, where general DERs kind of overtook everything else. This is really interesting because I think we attributed this to some of the co-op's hesitancy to like really push anything on their member owners and try to be there as a trusted energy advisor instead and not be and try to be technology agnostic. This is particularly interesting because in the long term, they go right back to focusing on a number of different technologies. So that suggests to us maybe there's something missing in this interim step, or maybe there's something else needed here. In the study, we also tried to control for different amounts of staff differences and also just capacity in the electric cooperatives to engage in their own transitions, because I think the literature on polycentric governance says like, well, you have to have the resources and the knowledge and the wherewithal to be able to make your own path in order to do this. And so we control for that by looking at both staff types and the size of the electric cooperative. And here you can start to see a bit of those differences. So the large cooperatives, there's really a few in the system that stand out, tended to focus a lot more on those general DERs, like saying to their consumers, like, we'll just design the rates, we'll do the education, you guys choose, you guys adopt, we won't push as much. The small and the medium, by comparison, really tended to focus on these technology-specific areas, which seemed to suggest to us they needed to rely on each other and even the G&T, Great River Energy, to provide them with insights and education on how to move forward in the system with these specific technologies. And here is just another table from our paper. There's a lot of stuff here, but the thing I wanted to just highlight here was how much of the rules that we coded for across the ideas tended to focus on these payoff and information rules. So you can see like in current time, the weighted vote being around like between the two of them, anywhere from 70% to 50% of the total. We attributed this to the fact that electric utilities rely so much on electricity rates to send price signals to consumers and tell them, here are the decisions you can make for DERs. And here's what the rewards, here's what the costs will be, whether you make those things or not. So they're incentivizing so much and doing so much through rates they're also trying to do so much through information and education. Electric cooperatives are pretty notable because they have a lot of really interesting and community engagement practices that actually I'm currently studying, such as member education groups. They have annual meetings where they vote everybody in or out. They also have newsletters, different community education systems like ride and drive EV events, all these different things that they're doing. And they really try to focus on those and push out more and more of those. But the other thing we see with these rules too is over time they start to diversify and focus not as much on payoff and information in the long run. So you can see these like scope rules in the long term becoming more important, choice rules becoming more important, aggregation rules, how they're working with each other becoming more and more important. So this chart tries to show the attribute of all these different ideas and the actor object. Who's doing what to whom. In this case, we tried to code it by rule type. This just shows on the left-hand side, the co-op in all these institutional statements is focused entirely, almost entirely on itself and what it can do for either the member owners themselves on the right-hand side or the co-op. And you can also see from the colors just how much of that is focused on these payoff and information rules. There are other actors that were specified in their ideas, but maybe partially due to the wording in our prompts, they tended to focus a little bit more on themselves and like what they could do. So you can see here, we, again, started to try to subdivide everything by these different rule types on top. And then on the bottom there, those different feedback pathways, and then just come up with percentages by row there, about where the co-ops were focused on all these different changes. So you can see again here, the payoff and information categories are garnering the most votes, in particular with that payoff structure category and that information context category. And so what that looks like, again, is those electricity rates coming down to member owners, member consumers, and trying to impact what choices they're making on a day-to-day basis. And those could be like very specific technology, specific rates coming in for things like air source heat pumps, rooftop solar, incentives, things like that. Or it could also be technology agnostic rates, like time of use rates, where your daytime rate might be lower, but then during the evening when everybody gets home, the prices go up to incentivize people to use less electricity. So the cooperative and the collective can build up less infrastructure. But then you also see those information context combinations too. And those look like, how do we send more information out to the member owners? How do we become that trusted energy advisor in this space? I think the other things that stood out to us here too is just, I think over time, you see that bright red mark on the payoff structure in the current time. But then how the rule feedback pathway combinations start to diversify over time too, and get lodged in all these different categories. So what we did next was focus on, okay, to make it more complicated or more complex, is to focus on what are the adjustment mechanism, feedback pathway, rule combinations that we could show here without just blowing everybody's mind up, and start to suggest what are the specific ways that the electric cooperatives could move forward in their system. And so, again, payoffs, thinking about incentives, rates, less practice around incentives over time, but about the same amount of emphasis on rates, in particular contributing to that governance structure over time too. So that suggests, okay, let's work on our rates up and down across the system too. when you break it down into actual adjustment mechanisms, then you start to see like, okay, when they talk about information, they're actually talking about education. They're talking about new research that they need for themselves to be able to move ahead on the system in the near term. And also on the long term, they're talking about in the near term and the long term too, these types of like aggregation, rule, pathway, adjustment mechanism combinations, where they're looking at collaborations and consultations and how to work with all these other partners in the system too. That includes DER installers, that includes nonprofits that we work with ourselves at the university. And in some cases, it is even included ourselves, which was kind of fun. But then you start to see all these other rules come across. I'll just talk briefly about the infrastructure, choice, and scope rules, which really came across in the long term. So thinking about in the long term technology services, what sort of grid hardware and software we need to set ourselves up, and this infrastructure rule that we made up to identify, this other rule that you need to set up for choice and scope rules. What sort of grid hardware and software do you need to be able to move ahead with DERs in the system? What sort of investments do you need to make in your own workforce under that training adjustment mechanism category? And then under choice and scope, like what sort of technology goods do you need to install in your own system to be able to do this? Some people talked about installing their own solar array eventually or their own battery. And then how are you changing the scope rules throughout this process too? That came across in terms of like, well, we want to have goals related to participation. So those are like more process rules, goals related to how we're changing the context of our situation, goals related to how we're changing the structure of our very cooperative. So what we see here in the system is just initially relatively, at least in our mind, condensed set of adjustment mechanism, rule pathway combinations, but then just like diversifies. And to us, that suggested a few different things in conjunction with those other slides that we just presented on. And I'll get to that in like 1 second. I just wanted to point out too, I think, we had a few different like unique components as we went through our study here. I think a lot of the polycentric governance literature tends to focus on these variance theories, so like how X affects Y, use like more informed research methods where they're getting consultation from community groups, looking at past change, and looking at really at natural resource systems. We tried to like push the boundary a little bit with what we were doing by trying to incorporate these process theories of change and bring in those change theories from Cloutier and Langley into the conversation. Try to bring in these more engaged research methods, such as the Nominal Group Technique, to think about how can we creatively study these institutions in use and try to shape them with the people themselves over time. And think not only about that retrospective change, but prospective change too. How can we change going forward into the future? And then finally, how can we start to engage these energy systems at a very critical time in our energy transition? I mean, it's going to be 90 degrees here in Minneapolis for about 5 days here in the next week, and for early mid-May, that's pretty radical. So for our case itself, GRE and their member cooperatives, I think what that diversification of those rule type feedback pathway adjustment mechanisms meant for us over time is that these shared infrastructure transitions for GRE and the member cooperatives and maybe other infrastructures may depend on shared capacity alignment among actors more than we think, and the heterogeneity among the actors in the GRE system. It might be a strength, but it might also be a point of weakness, particularly in between the large and the small cooperatives, which the latter need, I think, a little bit more support and guidance from the whole on how to move forward with everything. This is important for Great River Energy because, like I said in the beginning, they, like a lot of other G&Ts around the nation, have these shared governance forums. So on the left there, you have the board of directors, you have management governance through the senior staff, and then you also have the member manager group. as well as the information sharing teams. So what are the ways that we could use these current structures? And we've talked to them a little bit already about this, but how can you use these current structures or create new structures to really engage and facilitate that ongoing discussion in a conducive way to, that proliferating pathway of ideas over time? The other thing we tried to contribute in this paper, which I tried to point out at the beginning, was, yeah, how do you study change in polycentric systems? We point out in the paper that there's a lot of different linear, parallel, recursive, and conjunctive properties in our own very own data that were important to point out. We use the evolutionary perspective, so necessarily recursive perspective, but we believe that in policy process theories, you could use these other ideas to point out the ways in which things are changing and maybe point out other types of adjustment mechanisms or use other frameworks other than the COOF to study what's changing over time too. And then across those different studies, you could begin to generalize like, well, these are the motors for change in these systems. They've begun to do that in organizational studies, and a little bit in transition studies, but it would be really interesting to see it in policy process studies as well. And then I think our final contribution was just thinking around engaged research methods. The nominal group technique it worked pretty well for us, although we definitely have some advice for people who would want to use it for eliciting institutions and use, as we didn't go into the nominal group technique thinking we'd use the IGRI. So there's some tricks that you can do with it. But it really, really, and I want to emphasize this, depends on having deep contextual knowledge. So you're able to interpret a lot of their statements or interpret a lot of their ideas into statements effectively and responsibly throughout the research process. And then finally, just some like future applications and ideas for you all. I think just thinking about how to expand more polycentric governance work to the energy sector and also these electric cooperatives in particular. With eKIC, we're always looking for new research partners and new ideas and how to get more people engaged in the energy transition, since, like I said, we're at this very critical crossroads for how we proceed and limit global warming. And, the more people working on it, the better. I think also it's said a little bit in the paper, but I want to emphasize here too, like how do we as researchers create more avenues for practical resonance, not just generalizability, but real use works for community members and engaged research, so we can have our research be useful for practitioners. I think I spend like a fair bit of my time like theorizing to other theories and doing that sort of like grass tops horizontal work, but I'm really interested in how we can do this as researchers about how to do that vertical down to communities and from communities and kind of work back and forth in applied research. That said, I think there's also a bit of work to do around infrastructure regimes and shared infrastructure and how to generalize across these different sectors over time too. One idea that we had and that we've just been floating around for a while was, what would it look like if we had, their long-term ecological research sites? What would it look like if we had long-term socio-technical research sites? How could we study across, gas, electricity, water, all these different things that require technology and different types of resources other than natural resources, and contribute something a little bit general about that? And I think it's been started, but I would love just to have that conversation move forward. And that's all I got. That's a picture of us. We went on a field trip a couple years ago, and we're going again here and a little bit out to the Dakotas, and we bring a gaggle of students, both graduate and undergrad, to go basically touch a truck for a week and stick their head in some power plant boilers. Yeah, it's a really great experience, and we try to emphasize through C-STEP just the value of student training and getting people out in the field and talking to practitioners, since those people know a whole lot more than we do, and we're very thankful to all our electric cooperative friends for teaching us so much and correcting us as we kind of go along too. Yeah, with that, I'll leave the floor.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm just gonna stop the recording and reset everyone's screens here.